So hello everyone, welcome to the digital lecture series of Norwegian Centre for the Law of the Sea. Today is the fourth session and we have as our guest speaker Professor Ingo Venzke. We got up the bio. So he's Professor of International Law and Social Justice at the University of Amsterdam and Director of the Amsterdam Centre for International Law. He's written a number of monographs, including How Interpretation Makes International Law, on Semantic Change and Normative Twists for Oxford University Press, which won the Book Award of the European Society of International Law. And then it was named a Public Law Theory of International Adjudication, together with Armin von Bogdandy, also for Oxford University Press. Since 2015, Professor Venzke is editor-in-chief of the Leiden Journal of International Law. He has focused mostly on international economic law, legal history, and theory, and today he will talk to us about contingency and international law, which is the theme of a forthcoming book. Ingo, the floor is yours, and I remind the audience that we will take questions after the talk, and please submit your questions in the chat, and then I will relay them to Ingo. Okay, then again, thanks for being with us and for speaking to us and presenting your work, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vito. It's a great honor and privilege to have been invited to this lecture series. Thanks so much for having me, and everyone for joining. I just shared my screen. I hope that worked all right. Yeah, and it's an exciting moment. It's a premiere. We just got the cover in yesterday, so I'm happy to show it off here on the opening slide. It's, as Vito mentioned, the cover to a book, a volume that I co-edited together with John Kevin Heller on contingency in international law. The subtitle now is On the Possibility of Different Legal Histories. And this has grown out of a conference that we held in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, summer 2018, different times on this topic, with the ambition, as we put it back then in our call for papers as well, to recover contingencies in the history of international law that we thought have been lost. Has been a sense for such contingencies that has been glossed over, pushed into the background by several dynamics that present the course of international law as perhaps next to necessary. And what I do in my presentation today, Vito and I agreed that I would speak for about a maximum of 30 minutes, perhaps a little bit less, so we have enough time to exchange. I'm really curious to learn what you think. What I would do in this presentation is work along the introduction to this volume, where that sets out the main themes, the questions, and also some of the difficulties that actually remain when thinking through contingency in international law. But I do also want to say at this outset that it's been a very wonderfully interactive process with the conference participants and the contributors to the volume. So I've really learned a lot from all of them. I want to really make that very clear. It's been a very joyful, hard, difficult but joyful process. Okay, so without further ado, then I want to say a few things about why I care about contingency in international law. What's the motivation? What's the agenda? And I see it above all, and not everybody in the volume immediately would agree, but I would see it in service of facilitating change in international law. How so? It's to facilitate change, first of all, by refusing to resign to reality, to resign to the state of affairs as they have taken shape, and it is to open up that reality that otherwise perhaps seems all too necessary, natural, and even just. And I will say a few things about the connection between appearance of necessity as well as justice in a moment. And that is to counter, still more specifically, dynamics that close down that reality. By that I mean dynamics, I will speak on that as well, of hindsight bias, of rationalizing legal analysis, as it has been put in some streams of scholarship, that even though upon closer inspection you might say, of course, nothing is necessary, there's no theoretical account or body of thought that has really survived that would say, yeah, I mean, what happened was necessary. I mean, that's not the case. It's not a theoretically plausible account. That you would think of the development of international law as something, as an exposition of a natural plan, or as a expression of divine fiat or of fate. But still, there are dynamics in our social interaction, also in our scholarship, that still present the past as next to necessary, as a prequel to the present, rather than something that was ripe with possibility. There's a third motivation, and I indicate already on the slide that stands a little bit in tension with the second one. The third one is to understand why the things, after all, turned out the way they did. And I will say a little bit more about that tension. Now, in the way of thinking, in the introduction, I make explicit I state my love for Robert Musil, and make explicit how his wonderful novel on the man without qualities has been a good companion in thinking about contingency and international law. And I use him now here in the beginning of the presentation to also spell out the program, the agenda for the volume and for this scholarship as I see it. So first of all, he says in an early chapter of his Man Without Qualities that wherever there's a sense of reality, there must also be a sense of possibility. He immediately continues to write, however, of those, and I paraphrase him, delicate fools who are so overwhelmed by such a sense of possibility that they daydream with their heads in the clouds. Fools, quote, called idealists by those who wish to praise them. Those daydreamers cannot comprehend reality, or in their melancholic condition avoid it. These are people in whom the lack of a sense of reality is a real deficiency. So he actually points, if I go back a second, to the second motivation and the ambition to open up reality, but immediately points to the dangerous, in a way, or the being caught in daydreaming that is unconnected to reality. But he continues, there are also those that keep their feet on the ground and embrace a, quote, conscious utopianism that does not shrink from reality, but sees it as a project. So what I'm after with thinking about contingency in international law is a way of pursuing that conscious utopianism, to see reality as a project. But what Musil points to already in this early chapter is that pitfall, perhaps, of daydreaming and disconnect with reality. And I want to continue now on that tension between those two ambitions of opening up reality and understanding and keeping the feet on the ground, by reviving very briefly a long-standing debate that still serves as a point of reference to draw out those pitfalls, and also to situate the concept of contingency and how I think about it between those pitfalls. That's at least what I hope. And that's the debate by Isaiah Berlin on the left side of the screen and E.H. Carr on the right side, where Berlin intervened in the 50s, 60s above all, I believe, to in a way tried mostly what he seemed as Marxist, strongly structuralist accounts of history that seem to present history as a unfolding of a grand plan as according to social scientific hard rules, not leaving any space for human agency. And Carr retorted that that we need to understand the structural conditions for human agency more than anything else, so as not to fall for what in international law Susan Marks has then later called false contingencies. So claims to the possibility of a different action that are really difficult to sustain upon further inquiry. So perhaps the bad version of the Berlin trajectory would be some of the work of historian Neil Ferguson, who wrote about virtual histories where the great men of history make the history by virtue of their choice. Had only Napoleon not gone left but right, it would all have been different. Whereas Carr would push back and say, well, that's a very bad conception of how history has developed. We need always to understand the conditions for action. And I hope to situate contingency and the conception of contingency between those two strands by tying it to what was possible under the given circumstances as they presented themselves. What I encountered, and others as well in the volume, when trying to put that conception of contingency into practice, is that and this is perhaps also part of the difficulty, but also part of the explanation why contingency so quickly evaporates, is when do you stop asking why something happened the way it did? So it somehow has to be late enough for possibilities to persist, that not all developments also in international law become just an expression of their circumstances, but not too soon, so as not to engage in a false contingency, a claim that it could have been otherwise, that is oblivious to the determining forces that were at play at some point in time, at a concrete situated moment. And what I found helpful in that regard is the historical work of Reinhard Koselleck here, as also on other occasions, and he embraces and puts forward a historical notion of contingency that says, well, you have to continue asking why something happened the way it did until it is adequately explained. In that adequate explanation, the facts remain contingent, quoting him now, however much they can be grounded, they arise in the space of human freedom. So he ties the concept of contingency to human freedom. So it's an anthropologically centered conception of contingency. And in spite of quite a bit of headwind, I would embrace that as well. That's my conception of contingency. Now, what does it do? What is my target in a way? What am I arguing also against? So I said that there's no conception really of the development of the law that would put forward the idea that it's really necessary, an expression of divine fiat or natural plan or fate. What's then the problem? It's that there are dynamics of rationalizing with hindsight, of functionalist accounts of the law, and of a presentist use of the law that produce that necessity. Yeah, so the necessity as a target is not a characteristic of the historical processes, but it's something that is produced in hindsight through the way we engage with the law and engage the law. Perhaps a word about the rationalizing with hindsight. So there I lean on especially social psychological work in the tradition of Baruch Fischoff and others that have through experiments and otherwise shown how a sense of likelihood and possibility evaporates ex post. That after the fact we are smarter, but we feel much more. We feel as though in hindsight we look for the reasons why something has happened and render what has happened much more explainable and likely, even next to necessary than ex ante, and without good reason. So we are smarter after the fact, yes, but actually much less so than we would think. With the functionalist accounts, I mean accounts that see the law, for instance, of the global economy as an expression of globalization. That it reacts to functional needs, but functional needs do not determine the shape or form that the law should take, but they do create that impression. And with the presentist use, I mean the very understandable purposive use of the intentional use of the past, of a past precedent, of a judicial decision, in order to bring home a claim about what the law is in the present. That is a smart strategy, but makes for a bad history. So it's these dynamics above all that render legal developments as next to necessary, and against the background of which I hope that thinking about contingency takes off in an opposite direction. Namely, a direction that sustains a hope in the changeability of circumstances. And here I want to tease out a bit further the connections between thinking through and appearances of what is necessary or likely and what is desirable. So the first pages of political philosophy would tell us, well, these are two distinct questions. Whatever should be is something entirely different from whatever can be or is likely to be. Now, social psychological research has, however, shown that the two questions are very closely connected. So whatever is deemed likely is also deemed to be more just, or put the other way around, whatever is deemed to be just is also deemed to be more likely. And this connects to a deep-seated longing that people generally harbor of wanting to live in a world that is in principle just, and a world that is in principle just is a world where things happen for a reason. So thinking through about past possibilities and contingency in international law keeps open that hope in the changeability of circumstances that can impact what is likely, conceptions of what is likely, but and at the same time the related beliefs about what should be the case. So it is in that sense also motivational. You wouldn't want to change something that is just, and you of course would be a fool wanting to struggle against something that you deem impossible to change anyway. So I've spoken a lot about the motivation and the mechanisms with which I hope to pursue that motivation, and how the concept of contingency and the program of carving out contingencies in the course of international law relates to that. I hope you're still with me so far, as I would then now turn to some of the pathways of transformation. So what I've tried to do so far, yeah, as I just said, it's the motivation, the dynamics that close down contingencies, what can be done in response. And I've highlighted here to summarize the two risks of, on the one hand, overstating possibilities, and on the other hand, of resigning to reality. Now I continue with pathways of transformation. And there I sketch in the introduction and different chapters, tease that out differently in the volume, two great pathways. So the one would be the idealist pathway, and I think that's where thinking about contingency honestly is stronger when we're compared to the other materialist pathway. So the idealist pathway would change, well, a lot of things that hold us back in changing international law are belief structures that solidify once more the state of affairs and past developments having led up to the present, and once more present them as necessary. So there's a way this path suggests of recovering past possibilities to reach through the present towards a different future. And the sentence here is that's the first one, you might think of Hegel, and the second materialist one you might think of Marx, and this is of course from the Humboldt University, the famous adage saying, well, the philosophers have only interpreted the world differently. It's, what matters is to change it. And that strand might suggest that working on consciousness alone, to say, well, what we need to change our beliefs about necessity and possibility, that alone will not do the trick. So it's about changing the conditions that, well, shape those beliefs, and also allow people to act differently. And I must admit that they are working on contingency is perhaps less productive. That's a point that I am still struggling a bit with. There are ways of thinking through, of course, change under materialist conditions, definitely. Okay. So that's something also to consider still further. Now, one difficulty in addition to the question of where to stop, so not too late, not too early, so as to adequately explain something that has happened without reducing it to its context alone, and keeping open a space of possibility. In addition to that, it's been difficult to actually point to a concrete instance that would somehow have made a difference. So oftentimes, if you think of concrete judicial decisions, yes, of course, they could have gone the other way. So the claim to think through contingency in the course of international law is not so much about indeterminacy or, of a specific decision to say, yeah, this could have gone the other way. Yes, of course, that's nothing new. And the difficulty is to find, a change or a difference that would have made a difference. So to stick to the concrete example, perhaps, pull it down to earth and make it more concrete. There's one contribution by Josef Ostransky, who teases out the development of the investors' legitimate expectations as it developed in investment law. And he says, well, the leading decisions, they're visibly pulled out of thin air. There were also many contradictory decisions, and there's a question about how this one strand of jurisprudence became the strand, the precedent, and not the other. But even if we recognize that there's this contingency of that line of decisions, Ostransky argues, had that been different, it would not have made a difference anyway, because so in this case it was specifically about protecting investors' legitimate expectations on the basis of the fair and equitable treatment standard. we don't need to go into the specifics here, but he says, had that not happened this way, it would have happened another way. The investors' legitimate expectations would have been protected in a different way, under a different standards, because, well, in short, he says, look at the underlying political economy and structural conditions, power relations. So the moment he, like others, say there is an opening, there's a different possibility of different action, different judicial decisions, yes, perhaps, but at that moment, he, like others, is also thrown back on the structuring conditions that operate in the background, saying, yeah, perhaps, but it could not have been otherwise under the political economic conditions as they prevailed at the time. So contingency is closed down again. Now here, I think that that's too quick, and it insufficiently recognizes how the law is itself part of the structuring conditions. And I want to move to another way of thinking about contingency and showcasing it, not by contextualizing the law, yeah, and to make it part of that messy political struggle, and thereby try to say, well, look, it's nothing like a rational development in the sense of a timeless, locationless rationality. It's part of the messy struggle, and therefore it could have been otherwise. That's the push of contextualization, which then oftentimes carves out moments of contingency, but has a tendency of closing it down right away, as I've tried to illustrate with the example of Venzke. In addition to contextualization, you could think of what I would put the inside of the law, and debates about how to read the context of the law. Yeah. And one way of illustrating that is with the work of Emma Stone McKinnon in the volume, who looks at the emergence of the additional Protocol 1 in humanitarian law, that is commonly read against the background of struggles of decolonization, the wars in Algeria and elsewhere. So that to say, look, the contents and shape of the additional Protocol 1 and the ways that humanitarian law has developed in the 60s and 70s is determined by the context of struggles of decolonization. But wait a minute, Emma Stone McKinnon argues, what to make of that context was far from clear. So there was a strong debate on the inside, if I can put it like that, of the lawyers as to how to react. And the strategy of internationalizing the non-international armed conflict that was adopted in the additional Protocol 1 was only one next to others. And that's a moment of contingency where the law escapes its context. So it may happen that occasionally the law finds its fateful determination in the contextual circumstances. That is to say that at that moment, the law really has had no autonomy whatsoever. But more often, the law is real in the sense that it is autonomous, in the sense that it has independent reasons that are non-contextual reasons for why it developed the way it did. Yeah, so it's those two locations of contingency in addition to contextualization. So it's the idea that the law is also part of the context that structures it, and that there's contingency in the way of reading the context. Now, there's still one other location that I want to highlight for locating contingency, and that's in the rendering of history. Yeah, it circles back to the idea that beliefs about necessity, possibility, contingency are not characteristics of the historical process alone, but actually products of our way of thinking and writing about history. And I want to quote Musil just once more, because he illustrates both the production of necessity and also what can be done in response so well. So in the later chapter called wonderfully, what's it called now? The chapter, well, escapes me right now, but he writes of a professor at a social gathering, and he quotes that a professor, so it's not Musil speaking here, but one of his characters, right? That character, quote, spoke all. If we look left and right, we see an overwhelming mass of important events without recognizable direction. But looking back, everything, as if by a miracle, has become order and purpose. So what hides contingency narratively is the technique of fore and back shadowing, looking ahead and looking back. And when you look at histories in international law, that happens all the time. Contingency gets lost, even if it's, if you're close to getting it, it gets banned narratively. That's also a point that Sam Moyen makes very well in his chapter. And Musil and his is very well aware of this. So as you may know, his Man Without Qualities is set against the background of the First World War on the horizon. But the characters don't know that it's coming up. So they are all vested in planning an anniversary and so on, and don't know that this is happening. And Musil cannot finish his novel. So he has several endings, is unsatisfied with both, but he says, because he thinks that, well, the moment he adds an ending, the openness gets lost. So he is very much invested in a technique, not of fore and back shadowing, but what he calls side shadowing. Side shadowing as a necessity to convey narratively a sense of contingency. And one question is whether we can convey such a sense under the professional and other strictures that we face when we write histories of international law. So to conclude, I hope I've brought across a sense for three sides of contingency and contextualization, an O missing, the rendering, the reading of the context, and the rendering of history. And the hope is that all that makes some sense, and that it can support the fact that and sustain the hope that, as Adorno put it, fate and power will not have the last word. And with that, I would look forward to your questions, comments, and critique. Sorry, maybe one more thought, and this is anticlimactic now, but so I realize it's a digital lecture series in the Law of the Sea, so I haven't foregrounded the Law of the Sea, but just as a teaser, I also know that you had Suravi Ranganathan as a lecturer, as a speaker in the previous session. So she, as well as Alex Oude-Elferding, have chapters in the volume that speak more specifically on the Law of the Sea, just as a teaser. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ingo, for your very interesting presentation. So we opening the floor now for questions. Let me just open the chat. So I invite you all to write any questions you may have in the chat, and I will relay your questions to Ingo. And as you go about that, I will ask a couple of questions to initiate the Q&A session. So again, it's a really interesting talk on really articulating the potential and the role of contingency in exploring alternative legal histories and the development of international law. So my first question is about what for me is like the in a way the brother sister or contingency in looking at critically at history. I've done quite some work with genealogy, so immediately to me the question is, what about the contestations? So the contingency speaks about the way that things come about, and there were possibilities that are right, but at a certain point, and then they become realized, and at least only one of them become realized, and you kind of had this cemetery of possibilities that you want to kind of bring forth again and see how can they be used. But what about the element of power? So how does that figure in or alongside the path of contingency? That would be my first question. And another one, it's about this debate about the structure and agency, which in a way is like an ever-going debate. And I've always thought that I think the relative weight of each of these two elements is really about the circumstances, the situation. In some cases, there is structural elements that are really constraining, and then suddenly this constraint open up, and then the role of individual agency may become very productive. So I always thought that's a very dynamic and ever-changing relations, and I wonder how you also look at that specific point. Yes.
Should we collect? I react perhaps to give people more time. Yeah, so I react perhaps briefly. So on the last point, I see it exactly the same way. Yeah, I mean we've been at it for a decade. So I think the notion of a co-constitution of structure and agency, I would think in the lines of either Giddens or Bourdieu is a good way to think ahead. And then I also fully agree that there's different emphasis and different times. So I recently presented this in a different context where there were mostly political scientists, and of course they're right. So first of all, they were a bit less enthusiastic, but I don't know if you're all enthusiastic, but because they thought, wow, this is old news. You know, of course, we know from the historical institutionalists that there are critical junctures, and at the moment of critical juncture, it's all contingent. Yeah, I know that literature exists, but sorry. First of all, the good point of it is it supports precisely the point that you made, Vito, and that I share, is that there are moments where there's more possibilities of agency, and I think it's okay to call them critical junctures and to use historical institutionalism for that. What I did not share in that context is that therefore contingency is old news. I think there's still a great difficulty, and I don't see it so much, if at all, that claims to contingency are translated into plausible histories, plausible accounts of, yeah, under these circumstances of increased agency, this alternative was really plausible, and you know, this is how it could have come about. To the first point of power, yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah, so this is why I'm so why I'm stressed so much the worrying critical sensibilities of wanting to open up, but not losing a grip on the determining forces that close down at the very same time. Yeah, it's there front and center. So this is also why I said, you know, there's so much headwind in anthropologically, centering the concept of contingency. That because I do still think that there is that space. You know, sometimes it's wider, sometimes it's more narrow, but. Yeah, so if your main interest is to work out the sorry, one last thought. I'm rambling on, but I realized that. But one last thought. There's also an expression of power in maintaining beliefs in impossibility. So that's the power that the people in the 60s with the spray paint in Paris and the war slogan of "Sois réaliste, demande l'impossible" were after. It's the power that is vested in claims of impossibility.
Thank you, Ingo. So we have two questions. I'll read them up. So the first is from Julia Gons, and she asked if you see a relationship between contingency, as you're considering, and evolutionary interpretation, starting possibility from the idea of an overly deterministic past and what that means for law in the present. Then I have a second question from Magne Frostad, and we see to downplay, he means the role of chance in describing how we came to where we are. And in chance, there rests a great set of possibilities and similar amounts of frustration. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So off the cuff. So what do you, thanks for those questions. Julia, what your question about evolutionary interpretation prompts as a reaction is that it's indeed a lot of the more, I don't know if the formal informal distinction is helpful here, but informal ways of change. So not the grand design by treaty making. But the more interpretive mechanisms of change that I also showcased with the example of the development of legitimate expectations as in Ostransky's chapter. So I do consider those modes of change by way of interpretation. You might call that evolutionary. So I certainly don't think that the law was arrested at the moment of its when it was written down. I'm not so sure if that does justice to your question. And the role, Manya, of chance. So I think chance plays a great role, but tying the way I set up the concept of contingency opposes it not only to necessity but also to chance, because I tie it to human agency. So I think of chance as something that happens or doesn't happen, but we quote unquote, or better not, humans don't have control over it, and we are tackling that boundary a little bit with a chapter on the development of international private law, actually, and how I think the outbreak of the plague really pushed on, so it prevented a certain conference and pushed on international private law quite a different path than it would have taken without the plague. And you could, of course, think of Corona at the moment in a very similar fashion. I also realize it complicates these matters immediately because, of course, humans have had something to do in the making of Corona. So it's not a natural disaster. So I would want to exclude from the inquiry in this volume or in this strand. It's not, it's interesting to think through chance as well, and how the law relates to its context on chance occurrences. But it would be something that I would distinguish from what I'm after.
Thank you, Ingo. So there's another question. I think it ties in somehow with this idea of chance and the role it plays in the past, and maybe the lesser role that it may play towards imagining different futures, which are more tied, at least as far as we're concerned, with the human agency. But Jan Sossi asks, or he first says that it's easy to agree that the course of international law is not necessary, but then he asks, isn't it the most rational outcome under the circumstances? And how can it be made more rational, or should we not worry about international law being rational in the first place. And he connects this, he asks, with the notion of bias. And there is another lengthy question from Hilde, which I will ask right away. And from what I understand, she says your book looks at contingency in all fields of international law. I was wondering whether you had any comparative reflection on the role of contingency in the respective fields. Is the role or status, nature of contingency different in different fields of international law? And if so, why? And the negotiation on the Law de Sea Convention was, for example, characterized by several things: the needs for a package deal, the need to protect the interests of states they already had, the need to respond to scientific discoveries, and Ingo was wondering then whether that affects the role of contingency in a different way than the negotiation of other legal instruments. And subsequently, whether that allows us to make any predictions for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. With similar caveats, I would say to Jan on the with regard to the question about rationality, is that so it would be a larger conversation. What do you mean by rationality? It's the efficient pursuit of a given goal with the least detours necessary or so. So I mean, frankly, bluntly put, isn't it the most rational expression? I would say no. Why? Why would why would intuitively even support such a supposition? So it's a product of messy, sometimes nasty, ugly, sometimes a bit less ugly and nicer power play, and power understood not only by counting airplane carriers, but also convictions and beliefs, and also by ideas, and sometimes that can be deemed more rational and otherwise less. But I wouldn't think that there's a good presumptive evidence even to think that it is rational. And I know the theories that would say that so rationalist accounts, and there I would think that if I may be a bit provocative, they are usually ex post rationalizations with very little predictive power, because it's usually also an ex post identification of what actually amounted to an interest. And then you can say, well, I mean, given these, but usually it's okay, fine, I'm getting a bit carried away. But I think that's how I would think of the legal developments. I would not readily see them as a rational expression of interests, interest maximization. Hilde, there's an interesting thought. The comparative aspects between respective fields. I do not have a good reflection on that. What I do think, however, and it connects to the closing of locating contingency in contextualization, reading of context, and the rendering of history, that the more likely locations of contingency would indeed differ between the fields or regimes, if you want to say it that way, depending on their degree of autonomy from political and other kinds of processes. Yeah, so it's the degree to which law functions in an autonomous fashion. So it's never in an independent fashion. Yeah, it's not, but in a, you could also say semi-autonomous way, which means that it, at least to some degree, also has its own reasons for its development. I think that differs between fields, and the reason why that differs can have something to do with the degree of institutionalization, judicialization, perhaps degrees of conforming around recognized authorities that can say what the law is, those kind of dynamics.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, there's two more questions. One again from Julia, and she asks, how do we identify when the exposure of non-necessity will produce transformative potential? And then the second from Marie Petersman, she said you work with an anthropocentric understanding of contingency, focusing on human freedom and human agency. I wondered to what extent this understanding of contingency will remain relevant and useful for international law in a context of climate change and living in the Anthropocene more broadly, where hypercomplexity of unfolding events reduces human agency and discards the linear temporality and cause and effect thinking that seems to underpin your working definition of contingency. Is there a chapter that tackles the issue of contingency in this context and relates it to the role of non-human agency?
Yes.
And I think that would be the last question.
Thanks so much for both. Marie, on the limiting conditions of climate change and living in the Anthropocene, yes, I think you're absolutely right. These limiting conditions do exist. And there are a couple of chapters that tackle that, not specifically with climate change, but with regard to tech. So there's Fleur Johns that does that, and Jeff Gordon does it a little bit, not along these lines especially, but also pushing back against what he might say is my too easy enlightenment conception of subjectivity. So these, that's it's spot on. It's the case. Why I don't think that that it's devastating for me is that and that's really well, it's a good addition to our conversation and exchanges so far, is that where I'm coming from is mostly international economic law, and I see international economically as a key ingredient, or and private law extensions of the legal governing of the economy as a key inevitable component of successfully curbing climate change. And in that field, I see so there's also tech pushing back, definitely. I see also constraints, but the potential and necessity of human agency to live together differently, not only with regard to climate change, but also with regard to inequality and poverty. That's the last question, and perhaps the most tricky one. And it's kind of bracketed if there's time, so I'm trying to say there's no time. But the question about how the exposure of non-necessity will produce transformative potential. That's the million-dollar question that I tried to tackle head on to some extent, but I also realized that I did so at a very high level of abstraction that might not have been so useful with the pathways of transformation. So I think, and if I were to empirically ground it a little bit, it would be precisely in that social psychological literature on hindsight bias, and perhaps I can circle to bring on the follow-up question on rationality as a maximum of elimination of bias as well now. So that literature on hindsight bias points to rationalization as a way of creeping determinacy. That's how it's put there. It also points to counterfactual thinking as a debiasing strategy. So there are experiments showing that if you first think about what else could have happened, and you are trained to think that way, your assessments of the likelihood, and by implication also of the desirability of what has happened, would decrease. it's more, there are more conditions to that, because if you think about what else could have happened and you really can't think of anything else, it's also clear that your determination of likelihood and desirability would only increase. Because I mean, you can't think of anything else. So what happened had to happen. So that's a line of thinking that I think might be helpful to support the claim that there is a transformative potential. And I would also say it resonates with my just very idiosyncratic personal experience. So if I read the debate about the international economic order in the 60s and 70s, it's just wonderful. It's just so much, so widening the horizon. It's so much more interesting than the pay reform debate in investment law now. It's and if those were those were debates, and they had political traction. They were real. Yeah. Then I failed in pointing to an alternative possibility, but that's perhaps. And it was one of the reasons for this conference and volume. I cried out for help, so I couldn't manage to find out a real contingency. But it was also perhaps a bit of a wrong threshold, because what I also realized is that demands of the NIEO, regardless of the fact that whether they should have been or should now be heeded more so than they have been, which is really not so clear. Retain a normative surplus, I would say, a potential that is not realized, that persists even if there was no real possibility at the time. So there's a potentiality that persists, and it can still be realized. And in that sense, it's perhaps also arbitrary to cut off the past in the present. So what hasn't happened can still happen.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have reached our time limit. So I wanted to thank you, Ingo, for presenting to us. And this is now the end of this fourth digital lecture series. We have had a great chance to talk about contingency and international law. And I think that's a conversation may continue in the future. We look forward also to the book coming out, so we can look at all the different chapters. And I wanted also to thank the audience and those who have asked questions. And with that, I give you an appointment to the next digital lecture series, which is will be sometime in the future. All right.
Thanks so much for having me and for the great questions. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.